I sat wrapped in a soft blanket on the terrace, the cool evening air brushing against my skin. My face tilted toward the sky, where the sun was sinking slowly below the horizon, casting a golden reflection across the lake. A cup of green tea rested beside me, still releasing faint wisps of steam, and the delicate scent of jasmine filled the air. Andrew had only recently moved in with me after his parents' difficult divorce. At 18, he seemed older than his years. There was a quiet sadness and weariness in his eyes, as though he had already experienced more than most people his age. I hadn't seen him this reflective in a long time. Today, he seemed particularly withdrawn, and I could tell he needed space to process everything that had unfolded with him and Evelyn. He called my name softly as he stepped out onto the terrace. I looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, shifting uneasily from one foot to the other. "Is there anything I can do for you?" I asked, offering a smile, sensing that his request was more than just a polite offer. "Of course," he replied. "How about lending me a hand with the garden? The roses need some extra care this year. They've been particularly finicky." He smiled, and I caught a glimmer of interest in his eyes. We grabbed the necessary tools and headed to the garden. As we worked, memories of those summer vacations when he was a child flooded back to me. I remembered little Andrew running around in shorts, his hands covered in dirt, flashing me a grin with each mischievous moment. "Do you remember when you fell into the pond trying to catch that frog?" I asked with a laugh, reminding him of those silly moments that had once seemed so significant. "How could I forget?" he said, grinning. "You jumped right in to save me, only to fall on yourself right afterward." His eyes sparkled with that same boyish joy they had all those years ago. We both laughed, and I felt a familiar, almost familial warmth between us. The cool evening air wrapped around us, and for a moment, it felt as though time had slowed, offering us a peaceful break from the emotional storm we had both been navigating in recent months. Once the garden was sorted, we made our way back to the terrace, enjoying the quiet and the beauty of the sunset. Just when I thought the day had ended, I noticed Andrew staring at me intently. There was something new and unreadable in his expression, as if he were trying to make sense of something important. I felt a flicker of unease, but chose not to dwell on it. Then, unexpectedly, he moved closer. "You know," he began, his voice quiet, "I've always known you weren't like everyone else. You've understood me in ways no one else has." I froze, a warmth spreading through me as his words settled in. "Andrew, you've always meant a lot to me," I said softly, trying to steady my emotions. His gaze didn't waver. For a moment, his eyes seemed to grow darker, as though something had shifted inside him. Instead of continuing the conversation, he suddenly leaned in and lightly pressed his lips to mine. It was a brief, fleeting kiss, but my heart seemed to stop. I pulled away, caught off guard and embarrassed, a flush rising on my cheeks. The silence that followed was thick, awkward, yet I didn't want to break it. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice tinged with regret and confusion. "I don't know why I did that." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath to steady myself. "It's okay," I finally replied, though my thoughts were a whirlwind, as confused as autumn leaves caught in the wind. "Let's just forget about it, okay?" He nodded, though his gaze remained focused on me, as if studying me closely. I tried to smile, but deep inside, I could feel something stirring, a quiet, inexplicable feeling beginning to take root in my heart. The next morning, I woke up early, hoping the busy routine would help me forget the previous evening's events. In the kitchen, I heard the sound of dishes clattering, and I immediately realized Andrew was already up. I wanted to avoid him, to give myself time to process everything. But it was hard to hide in such a small house. Taking a deep breath, I gathered my courage and stepped into the kitchen, hoping I could act calm. Andrew stood by the stove cooking eggs. He seemed focused, but I noticed a quick, almost nervous glance he threw my way. "Good morning," he said brightly, as though trying to ease the tension between us. "Good morning," I replied, attempting to sound casual. "Breakfast for both of us?" I asked, hoping to keep the conversation light. "Of course," he said with a small smile, though I could see a slight shadow behind it. We ate in near silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I knew we couldn't just ignore what had happened, but I wasn't ready to bring it up yet. After a few moments, I decided we needed something to do to break the tension. "Andrew," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt, "could you help me with the old shed? There's something that needs fixing, and I could really use an extra set of hands." "Sure, why not?" he said, clearly relieved to have something else to focus on. We made our way to the old shed, where tools and wooden crates were scattered around. I flicked on the light, and the dim bulbs cast a soft yellow glow over the dusty room. We started sorting through tools, moving boxes, and debating what to keep and what to throw away. But as we worked, the tension between us grew, becoming almost tangible. His presence was too close, and I buried myself in a shelf, trying to focus on my task. But suddenly, I felt his eyes on me. "You can't just pretend nothing happened," he said quietly, his voice a mix of discomfort and resolve. I froze, feeling my heart race. "Andrew, I don't think this is something we should be talking about right now," I replied, my voice trembling despite my attempt to stay calm. Inside, a storm was brewing. He stepped closer, his voice growing more intense. "No, we have to talk about it. I can't shake the feeling that something important changed, and you know it too." I turned away, unsure how to respond. His words were blunt, but there was an undeniable truth to them, and something in me was touched. At that moment, his hand brushed against mine. I turned sharply to face him, meeting his eyes, deep, filled with emotions he couldn't hide. "Andrew, don't," I whispered, but he took another step forward, his breath brushing against my skin. In that moment, everything around us seemed to vanish. Then he kissed me again. This kiss was different, more urgent, desperate for a response. For a moment I stood still, but then I pulled back, my mind racing. "No, this is wrong," I said, stepping away, but still unable to look away from his eyes. I felt lost, unsure of how to react. It all felt too confusing, too dangerous. Andrew immediately took a step back, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice shaking. I don't know what's happening." I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Andrew, we need boundaries. What's happening could hurt us both," I said gently, trying to calm him and myself. He nodded, though I could tell he didn't fully agree. "Just let me figure it out," he said quietly, and I knew this conversation wasn't over. It would continue to build, like a wave getting ready to crash. We walked back to the house in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. But I knew one thing. This story was just beginning, and it would change both of us in ways we couldn't yet understand. In the days that followed, I tried to act as if nothing had happened. I threw myself into the routine, meeting with friends, managing the house, tending to the garden, anything to keep my mind occupied. Every time I saw Andrew, a sense of unease stirred within me, one that I couldn't ignore anymore. It seemed like he was doing the same, avoiding conversations, and even eye contact. Living under the same roof felt increasingly awkward and tense. I knew we needed to break the cycle of discomfort, so I decided to suggest something completely different to distract ourselves. "Andrew," I said one morning over breakfast, trying to keep my tone casual, "how about we head to the farmer's market in the next town today? We could take a walk, grab some fresh produce. Maybe it'll help us unwind a little." He looked at me, a bit surprised, but then nodded. "Why not?" he replied, his voice carrying a hint of gratitude, even though he didn't say it outright. Maybe he felt, like I did, that this was a way to ease the tension between us. We drove down a narrow road, flanked by fields and forests, heading for the nearby town. I turned on the radio, letting the music fill the silence in the car. We exchanged a few words about the weather and how long it had been since our last visit to the market, but everything felt forced, like we were both struggling to find the right things to say. The market greeted us with a vibrant sense of fresh fruit, baked goods, and flowers. We wandered through the stalls. I tried to act cheerful, but his presence lingered too close, almost tangible. We bought apples, cheese, and some bread. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet something felt off as we passed by an antique shop. Without warning, Andrew stopped and pointed to the window. Evelyn, look, he said, his voice suddenly bright with enthusiasm. I turned and followed his gaze to an old music box sitting in the window, adorned with faded gold and delicate ceramic inserts. For a moment, my breath caught. That looks like my grandmother's, I began, but my voice shook. It's just like hers. It does, Andrew replied, moving closer to the window and placing a finger gently against the glass. You said it was very special to you. I nodded, a chill running down my spine. Yes. It was her jewelry box. She kept old letters and photos in it. Andrew was quiet, but I could feel him studying me, trying to understand why this was so important. Do you want to go inside? He asked softly. I nodded, and we walked into the antique shop. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the dim light made the place feel even older. The music box sat on a shelf, surrounded by forgotten objects. I took it carefully in my hands, slowly opening it. Inside, there was an old dried rose and several yellowed letters. Andrew glanced at the letters, and something in his expression shifted. Can I see those? He asked, his voice hesitant. I handed him the letters, and he began to flip through them, his face growing serious. There's something here about our family, he murmured, sounding almost shocked. Some arguments that happened before I was even born. A wave of anxiety surged in me. These letters. I hadn't known they were still around. I didn't know they still existed, I said, suddenly feeling the need to take them back. But he kept reading, his face growing darker. Why didn't you ever tell me about this? His voice was calm, but edged with frustration. Evelyn. I could hear the tension in his tone, and I tried to ease the situation with a joke. Some things aren't meant for dinner conversation, I said lightly, but I couldn't hide the tremor in my voice. Andrew nodded, though he didn't seem convinced. Maybe, he replied quietly, but I'm starting to realize there's more to our family than I ever knew. A coldness settled in my chest. The letters, the old music box, the growing tension between us, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit, and I had no idea what the bigger picture might be. As we left the shop, I realized that our trip to the market hadn't lightened the mood. If anything, it had made the tension between us more tangible, more unsettling. We drove back in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. The letters and the music box had added more uncertainty to an already strained atmosphere, and it felt as though an invisible weight was pressing down harder on me. Andrew seemed lost in his own thoughts, occasionally glancing out the window, as if searching for answers to some unspoken question. I suggested we take a walk by the lake and have a picnic. The lake had always been a place where I could find peace, a sanctuary of solitude. I hoped it would help both of us find some balance. We walked along the winding path, the tall trees casting long shadows as we neared the old wooden dock. Andrew immediately suggested we go for a swim, just like we used to when he spent summers here as a child. Come on, the water's so warm, he said with a smile that felt a little too forced, too bright. I laughed as I watched him dive into the lake, sending up 1,000 tiny splashes that broke the smooth surface of the water. He looked so carefree, so full of life, that I suddenly felt older, more vulnerable than I ever had before. The water, the sun, his laughter, it all felt so distant, like a memory from another time when things were simpler, when everything seemed clearer. Andrew swam back to the shore, his wet hair clinging to his face, water droplets sliding down his skin. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. He swam closer, laughing, and splashed water at me. I flinched in surprise, but quickly laughed back. Then, I felt him move even closer, so close that I could hear his heartbeat quicken. He looked at me with such intensity, as though trying to reach into my thoughts. You know, Evelyn, he said quietly but with a newfound confidence, you've always been more to me than just an aunt. I can't hide it anymore. I froze, not knowing how to respond. There was something dangerous in his words, as if he had crossed an invisible boundary. Panic began to rise within me. Andrew, you don't understand what you're saying? I said, trying to stay composed. No, I do, he replied, his voice firm as he took another step closer. Maybe you're just afraid to admit it. Before I could find the right words, He leaned in and kissed me again. But this kiss was different. It felt spontaneous, full of determination, and I could feel something tightening inside me. His lips were warm, full of confusion and intensity, as though he was trying to pour all his unspoken feelings into that one moment. For a brief moment, I stood still, stunned, but then a strange warmth began to rise within me. It felt as if everything around us disappeared, leaving just the two of us standing on that old dock, the lake reflecting the sky like a perfect mirror. For a second, I gave in to the sensation, but then I abruptly pulled away, as if snapping out of a trance. "No, Andrew," I said, my voice trembling. This shouldn't have happened. We need to stop." His face twisted with pain for a brief moment, but then he became serious again. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why are you so afraid of this?" I didn't know how to respond, and a deep sense of helplessness filled me. "Because it's wrong," I finally managed to say. "You're still young. You're just confused." He stepped back, his face hardening. "Do you really think this is just confusion?" he asked bitterly. "I feel like I've found something real here, something I can't just ignore." "Andrew, we need to go back home," I said, trying to shift the conversation. I could feel this was heading into dangerous territory, and I didn't want to go any further. I turned and walked away from the lake, trying to hide the trembling in my hands. I heard him follow me, but I didn't look back. We walked in silence, and I could feel something between us, something invisible but heavy. It was more than just words or actions. It was a shadow that seemed to grow darker with every step, pulling us towards something unknown and frightening. When we returned home, the evening light streamed through the windows, casting warm shades of orange and pink across the walls. I felt utterly exhausted, like I had just woken from a long, restless sleep that left me with a lingering sense of unease. Andrew went to his room, and I stayed in the kitchen, absent-mindedly sorting through the market purchases. Inside, a storm of emotions still churned: guilt, fear, pain, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door. It was a knock that sounded urgent, like someone with pressing news. I flinched and walked toward the door, not knowing what to expect. Standing there was my mother, Ella, looking anxious, her face etched with worry. "Mom, what's happened?" I asked, the unease growing inside me. Ella studied me for a moment, her eyes scanning every detail of my face. "I need to talk to you," she said, entering without hesitation, as if she had every right to. "And with Andrew, too." A wave of tension swept over me. "Why with Andrew?" I asked carefully, closing the door behind her. "Because I know something is going on between you two," she said bluntly, her words hitting me like a punch to the stomach. Panic surged through me. "What do you mean?" I tried to play it off, but my voice betrayed me, shaking. "Don't pretend, Evelyn," she snapped. "I've seen the way you look at each other. You can't hide that look on your face. Tell me the truth." Everything inside me turned upside down. My mom had always been sharp, far too perceptive for my comfort. "There's nothing between us, Mom," I said, keeping my voice calm, though I felt everything inside me crumble. It's a difficult time for both of us." Ella gave me a skeptical look, her expression stern and confused. "Evelyn, you know it's more than that. I heard Andrew say something to you this morning. He's not hiding his feelings." Fear spiked inside me. "What did he tell you?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "He didn't say anything specific," she replied, but I could see it in her eyes. "I saw his face when he left. He's clearly in love with you. And that's wrong, Evelyn. You need to stop this before it gets out of hand." Just then, Andrew appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face was serious, but calm. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his gaze flicking between me and Ella. "That something is happening here that shouldn't," Ella said sharply, turning to him. "You need to understand that this can't continue." Andrew's body tensed, and I saw the same spark in his eyes that I had seen by the lake. "You don't understand," he said, his voice steady, but tinged with irritation. "I know what I feel, and this isn't just some passing phase." "Andrew, stop," I intervened, trying to take control of the situation. You shouldn't talk about this like that. It's more complicated than you realize. Ella turned to me sharply. You tell him to stop, but you can't even do it yourself, can you? Well, I can't just leave it like this, she continued. I'm going to call your father, Andrew. Let him decide what to do. No, Mom, don't. I almost shouted, but the words hung in the air. It was too late. Andrew froze in the doorway. Are you serious? He asked, his voice quiet but laced with anxiety. You're going to involve my father? Is that all you can do? Yes, I am, Ella replied firmly. Because I see you both getting tangled up in this, and I won't stand by and let you ruin your lives. Andrew turned to me, his eyes full of disappointment. Did you know she would do this? He asked. I felt my heart tighten. No, I didn't know. I mumbled, the pain rising within me. Andrew turned back to Ella. Fine, he said, his voice cold. If you think calling my father is going to fix this, then go ahead. But I'm leaving. I'm not going to stay here and listen to you decide what's best for me. Without another word, he turned and stormed out the door. Ella, agitated and angry, followed behind, throwing me one last look filled with disappointment. You should have been smarter, Evelyn, she called over her shoulder before the door slammed shut. I was left standing alone in the silent, empty house, the weight of the situation sinking in. It felt like something important had just snapped, like a fragile thread that could never be tied back together. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing. I could no longer escape the consequences.